and it's fantastic to be here again. I don't know how many of you realize, but actually I've been here now coming to this event for the past 8 years. So this is the 8th time I've been here. I think I came to the first one. And it's actually every time I come, I'm always very impressed with the level of this event. And especially in terms of the breadth of the event, how wide it is, the level of it, the discussion that goes on, the active debate that goes on. It's a very, very high level event, and I'm very pleased and honored to be here again. And thank you to Tomasz. And I think that very often when I come here, I don't think people maybe here, I'm not sure if everyone in Slovenia necessarily realizes how well regarded Tomasz is outside of Slovenia. And I think from the people that I meet going all around the world, as I do, I think Tomasz is probably one of the most broad expert people that I have met anywhere in the world. So thank you very much, Tomasz, for inviting me. And okay, so first of all, I think what I'd just like to say is, how many of you here have iPads? How many people here own an iPad or have an iPad? Okay, it's not many. Okay, so we're maybe not very representative as a start. How many people here have an iPhone? Okay, so actually not that many, but quite a few people have iPhones. How many people actually that have an iPad or an iPhone actually thought before they had the iPad or the iPhone that before Apple invented the iPad or the iPhone, that they would want an iPhone or an iPad type of device? Does anyone here actually think, did anyone here before they had those devices available think, I would actually want something that has a whole load of apps that makes me play these strange games on my telephone and enables me to check all sorts of little things and download these little services on my phone? I would challenge actually anyone here to actually say that they had envisaged that, or even if someone had suggested it to them, that they would actually have thought it was a good idea. And but actually, even people in that business weren't necessarily all in favor of that idea when it happened. But of course, now we've seen the level of success that has brought. And I'm not just trying to go through this Apple boasting thing again, but just to say that what I think is very important is to realize that just because customers don't ask for something, just because customers haven't displayed an interest in something, and just because you maybe cannot quite comprehend right now how those services might turn into a good business model, it doesn't mean that those offerings are not a potential for great revenue in the future. So that's just maybe a baseline for what I'm talking about. And also, when we therefore think about energy-related services, whether it's energy efficiency or the future demand response services that will happen in the energy industry around the world, of course, I'm in this industry surrounded by a lot of people who are very negative to any of those kinds of claims that these services will be successful. And fair enough, they are very often boring. They are actually very often not saving customers very much money. And in many cases, they don't necessarily show a clear business case for utilities or any other companies that may be providing those services. And for sure, we can also find many examples of cases where those offerings haven't worked in pilots or early programs or tests of one kind or another. We see that many of those have failed. But actually, what I'm sort of here to tell you today is that, well, we've been looking around the world, literally around the world, working with utilities and all sorts of other companies, investigating those programs that work and those that don't, and cases that are successful and those that are not, and the emerging technologies and the emerging services, and even those that haven't yet been even made public yet, and trying to say one thing: it's not what you do, it's the way that you do it that ultimately matters. And at the moment, very few people have really got to grips with the way it should be done. But just to give a little bit of background, okay, this is something we found in Australia. This is one of the markets we follow. And this was actually in Melbourne. Melbourne has been rolling out smart meters, and they have now pretty much rolled out a lot of them. And as you can see, this is one person's smart meter. Some customer put this in the front of their smart meter and actually just said, fuck off, no smart meter here, thank you. You know, they're polite in Australia, so they say thank you afterwards. But basically, this is a real case. This is a real case. And actually, to be fair, it kind of sums up the general public feeling towards the utility that was putting those smart meters out at the time. And I would say it's not that different to the opinion that the customers have of many utilities around the world at the moment. And I'm not sort of specifying any particular utilities. Even if it's not that bad, the fact is that energy companies have not always been successful at rolling out new offerings. We know that. And so I remember once in Austria, one person, actually one of the guys in the regulator once said, when their companies in Austria were rolling out all sorts of multi-utility services, or trying to, and he said, wait a minute, we can't even sell electricity yet, why are we trying to sell other services? And there's some truth there, but the fact of the matter is that things are emerging and things are changing quite a lot all the time. And just because we haven't been successful in rolling out services in the past, it doesn't mean that we cannot succeed. And I've noticed over 16 years working in this industry on various issues that we tend to be an industry where we think that if we've tried it and it doesn't work or hasn't worked, it cannot work. And I don't agree with that. I think that you have millions of cases around the world, literally, well, at least hundreds of very, very high-level cases that you could name, where things haven't worked out the first time, but they have worked out extremely successful eventually. We mustn't try to be a Neanderthal here. We have to be modern companies if we're to succeed in the modern future. And just to say very briefly about who we are as a business, if you don't know us, I'm sure many of you don't. So we are a global energy think tank, VaasaETT, and we are literally very global in the sense that we work all around the world to bring expertise together in many different forms and to help utilities and vendors and regulators and all sorts of other interest groups to function and to have and know best practice around the world. I won't go into detail. You can look here if you get the things, but we are very, very, there's a lot of information around the world that we are the only ones that actually have relating to competition, switching, prices, smart energy demand, and so on. And in addition to being CEO of VaasaETT, I'm also a board member of the Smart Energy Demand Coalition. And this is a coalition of many organizations, as you see, a mixture of associations, utilities, vendors of various types, and a whole range of different expertise that meets together to try to really bring forward the position and the expertise of the smart energy demand side. So trying to say that we cannot achieve everything through actually the energy that we generate. We have to balance it with the way in which we demand energy at the other end. And as you see, there are some very major players in that and a very mixed group of interests. And just in case anyone's interested, we also have an event at Leeds Castle. And luckily, we've actually got Tomáš also appearing there for that event. If you want to attend a really spectacular event and learn all about these issues, then this is maybe the place to come. Okay, so just say where we get our knowledge from. We've got 3 public reports that you can all download for free, which have a huge amount of information on some of these issues. And one of them is a report we did called Empower Demand, where we studied 100 offerings and programs around the world. Another one was Empower Demand 2, where we looked at how companies manage to get customers to engage in these services. In other words, what was the psychology? What was the communication behind it? How did we involve customers? Very much the first report looking at the quantitative results, and the second report, this one, looking at the qualitative reports, really trying to understand the psychology and behavior behind it. And also we do our yearly switching report, where we analyze 38 markets around the world in terms of competition and switching behavior and what leads up to that. Okay, so Slovenia, where is Slovenia in all of this at the moment? Well, actually, as people know, there has been a lot of activity recently in Slovenia. And in the 5 years that you've been a fully competitive retail market, as we'll call it, so full retail competition, Slovenia has evolved a lot. But we would still say, when we categorize countries into their style and their behavior, that actually Slovenia is still at an early stage of competition. Slovenia is still has many stages to go through. And these are one of the things that we sort of generally map. So you are becoming active, but you are still at an early stage. And as we've seen, there's a lot more competition in Slovenia, both in electricity and gas recently. And I realize, I think in a way, Slovenia is maybe most comparable to Ireland at the moment. Ireland had a situation where the incumbent utility had a price to beat imposed on it, which basically means that the incumbent utility, which was the main utility in the country, owned by the state, was not allowed to reduce its prices for a period of approximately 2 years. And during that 2-year period, other companies, and in particular a company called Borgas, managed to win actually around about over 20% of customers. In that 2-year period, ESB, the incumbent, lost 40% of its customers until the price to beat was taken off by the regulator. And that led actually to a market which now has several different players in it. But as we said, it's similar to the Slovenian market in that initial saving was not totally, how would I say, it wasn't due to simply competition, it was due to opportunities in that market for some to come in and offer at a lower price. So the thing is that this market, Slovenia, is not unusual. It's not particularly common either in the way that it's behaved, but there are other cases that we can use which enable us to pretty much foresee where this market is going to go in the future. And we know that Slovenia will become more competitive, and it won't be with the same players necessarily that we're seeing being in the market at the moment. There are going to be new players coming into this market, even though it's a small market, according to outsiders' point of view. And evidence shows quite clearly that truly active markets, once they become active, stay hot in the long term. We haven't really seen any truly active market that has become inactive. There are times when markets become less active. That's just a cyclical thing. But actually, markets generally become more active over time, even when they're already very active. The most active markets in the world have an annual switching rate of between 25 and 30%. And actually, that's a pretty high level for the energy industry to absorb. And there are some positive consequences of that and some very negative consequences of that too. For one thing, as odd as it may seem, because competition is intended to improve benefits for customers, in terms of customer satisfaction, in a traditionally oriented energy industry, increased competition leads to increased dissatisfaction in the industry, believe it or not. If you look at markets, and this is just one example, Australia, as the competition level has increased, prices have increased, and I'm not saying that the two are directly correlated, but the two do often go together. And in Australia, there are many other factors that led to those price increases, but for sure, competition hasn't made prices lower overall in the long term. And complaints have gone up at the same time. This is just one example, but we see many examples. Sweden is another case. There are many others I could mention. So ultimately, this is quite a common experience that overall, and Britain would be a perfect case in point, I think the British energy industry hasn't been less popular. I think the only industry, I think actually there was something that was saying in Britain, the only group of people that are less popular in energy utilities at the moment are prisoners. And this is quite an extreme case, according to surveys. So what is the consequence of all of this competition? It means that the value of our customers, or what we would call it, the customer lifetime value of customers, depletes or reduces significantly over time for any kind of incumbent utility. If this was an incumbent utility, and I'm not saying Slovenia specifically, but in any country as a whole, you see that you start off with a situation where you have this is just taking one example. This is a customer type. This isn't indicating how many of those customers you have. But what we're saying is that you generally will keep a customer, let's say on average, for 20 years. You end up with this kind of gross margin. You have your cost to serve, and this is your profit below the price as a retailer, as a retail part of the business. Now, if you then if you then take that forwards and you look at what happens after competition, so the previous one was before competition, after competition you end up with a situation where suddenly you've got three groups of customers essentially. You've got customers that you will lose, and for that matter the customer lifetime of that customer is maybe reduced to, let's say, 3 years on average. You have customers still that you keep that will never switch. In fact, that's maybe half your customer base perhaps. And customers you will lose and win back. And that is also quite a good segment as well. But each of these segments has very different costs. If you look, you have the base cost for all of them, but then you also have these other costs. You have the cost, CTA means cost to acquire, and CTR means cost to retain. So you have costs of getting and costs of keeping those customers. And of course, those costs come out of your margin. But at the same time as the margin, the costs increasing, your revenue, in other words, the price you can charge at for certain groups of customers, decreases, which ultimately means that, and that may just be through reduced prices or through discounts or through benefits or through other savings of kind. But basically you end up with this situation in most markets where you have less profitability for those customers. And then look at a company that's then trying to win customers, and you get these extra two segments coming into it. Customers you win and they stay, one-time switchers. They're the customer, the holy grail of customers that you win. Customers you can win once and they stay with you. They have a relatively low cost to acquire, or same cost to acquire sometimes, but typically a lower cost to acquire and a lower cost to retain. The reason the cost to acquire and retain is lower is simply because you keep those customers longer. And so if you average out those costs of winning them over the time you have them, you end up with a lower yearly cost of winning those customers. And then you've got this customer base that you really wouldn't want, and many utilities around the world that lose them are actually quite happy to lose them. And those are these customers who you have massive costs because they don't stay with you very long. They're promiscuous customers, as we'd call them. And you can only offer them, you have to give them big discounts, big savings, which means you ultimately make no profit on them. And your lifetime value is zero or minimal on those customers. So you end up with this situation which is not looking good, because actually if you think of it, your overall average customer lifetime value compared to what it used to be before liberalization is much, much lower. And although in some cases we've seen some markets where margins on average increase, the gross margins increase because of competition, this doesn't change this basic picture here. And you've got a situation, for example, in Australia, the most active market in the world, where gross margins have actually increased in some cases, but the profitability on the customers is extremely low on retail customers. And that's because of those issues you mentioned. So increased competition brings reduced customer lifetime value unless you increase customer base or the quality of your customer base or sell new services. And this is what I'm getting at here. This is why you need to sell new services, because you're trying to plug the gap in the revenue that you've lost and you will continue to lose over time. So a commercial market for smart energy demand is then emerging as a way of plugging this gap. And we're seeing new things. And this is just one example. It's kind of a cool new example. I'm not saying it's going to be the most successful. It's early days. They're trying it out. But this is a real commercial offering, for example, that Fortum, actually in Finland, and I'm not saying that Finland is great at marketing. Generally, the Finns are not very good at marketing. But actually, it's an interesting offering. It's an offering provided by, actually in this case, their corporation. What happens is that, if you know, the spot market in the Nordic countries, Nord Pool, is quite volatile. And it's very efficient. It's a very efficient spot market. And they've managed to link customers' heating, electric heating systems in this case, but it could be gas, it could be other forms of heating. But they've managed to link the electricity heating systems in people's homes to the spot market. So in other words, the heating system follows the spot market, and this brings two benefits. It brings benefits to the utility, who has reduced risk on the wholesale market. It also brings benefit to the customer because the utility shares that benefit with the customer. In other words, it's a profit-sharing agreement whereby the utility makes a benefit and the customer makes a benefit. And the customer, therefore, only has to pay a small amount for this service. They don't have to pay the full amount because the company isn't just making money from saving energy, which it does. The customer also saves energy through this, but they're making money through the way that they interact in an intelligent way with the spot market. And this is just a sign of the future. It's no longer about can we just save the customer energy. It's about how can we make relationships with the customer that are mutually beneficial to both the customer and the utility, and the profit sharing helps both parties. So this is just one example of something that's happening. It's a commercial offering. It's being offered to real customers as a real commercial offering. And we know, for example, that customers do save. We know for a fact that they are saving energy in good programs, and we know that they are satisfied with those, but we also know that in bad programs, they're not. And it's a case of going back to what I said before, that the savings are very high in good cases, and they're very low in bad cases. The customer satisfaction is very high in some, and very low in others. But what matters ultimately is the way that you do it. And just to give a couple of examples, first of all, this is just, in terms of in-home displays. Most in-home displays that show how much energy you use are ugly, they're not intuitive, they're pretty bad, actually. But some of them are very good, and the latest ones are getting very, very good. I actually have one in my own home. I actually bought it from Fortum as a normal customer because I wanted to see the whole experience. And actually, I've been amazed how much my family uses it, and how much my children use it, and how much they like it. And actually, it's not a big saving. I'm not exactly going to get rich out of using this thing. But can I ask you, how many people here, since childhood, have turned off lights when they leave the room? Okay. Do you think you make lots of money out of doing that? You don't really make a lot of money out of doing that, but you do it, right? And this is how these sorts of feedback mechanisms also work. If you think you won't sell things because the customer doesn't make enough money, you don't understand why the customer's really ultimately getting involved in it, because that's not. But of course, if you tell them that's why they're getting involved in it, they are pretty disappointed if they don't make loads of money after they've been given it. So that's just one thing. Also, if we look at, this is just one kind of wacky thing. It's a display, it's a kind of display in Sweden, which is actually now being offered as a commercial offering to people. It's actually being offered as a product, standalone product, a clock that kind of shows how much energy you use, but in a really cool way. And then we've got this system here by Tendril. They're working now with a company in Australia called Origin, which is one of the main utilities there. And it's a system based on apps. In other words, the customer has an app-based interface, which means that all kinds of energy saving and energy services can be offered from any third party through that interface to control their home, to control their energy, to control savings and electric cars in the future and whatever. But you have one common interface that effectively allows all sorts of applications to build onto that in a way so you don't have to figure out what services to offer. You let the third parties do it. And they're even doing this thing in Australia whereby they're having competitions. They've done it in America too. Competitions for third parties to deliver apps that customers will make use of. So it's open architecture. It's very exciting, and it means that we don't have to know where the future goes because we leave that up to the application providers. And also things like heating. This is a cool device actually by Passive Systems, a brand new one as well, whereby it links with people's solar power on their house. And it means that it links their home heating, whether it's gas or whatever, to their solar power on the roof, so that the two work together intelligently to provide energy at the cheapest cost for the customer at the cheapest time of day. And it actually learns as well what your preferences are and how you want to behave. So ultimately, these types of systems are very different from what we were thinking in the past. They're intelligent, they learn, and they provide more added value than simply just saving you energy by turning something off. And also just thinking this one particular case, there are examples, for example, where they, actually what I didn't mention there was actually this company, O-Power, which some of you may have heard of. Giving people a piece of paper telling them how they use their energy sounds like a boring thing to do. O-Power somehow have mastered it so that companies that you would never imagine would have given these services to their customers are now doing it and preparing to do it. And it's incredibly appealing to customers. Customers really like it and they're very satisfied. It's not what they're doing, it's just that they have built an amazing technique for doing it. And actually I'll go past these for time. For example, in this particular case, this company is not just telling customers how they can save money, but how they can save money at different times of day if they have variable tariffs. A future thing here, I know, but just some of these services. But in terms of delivering these offerings, how do we do it? Well, ultimately, what we've found is that just in terms of savings, your average program that people will say haven't been very effective are between 0 and 5%. When you start to include more of the prerequisites for doing it well, you end up with up to, well, more probably between 15 to 17% already proven through programs that have been done in savings. Not that you want to save energy. And the potential for the future is even greater. But the reality is, it's not all about savings. It's about providing value to the customer, and that can come in many different forms, through convenience, through helping them to save money on other energy types. And what we're seeing is that there are more and more innovative business models and more intelligent technologies coming on the market. So the time hasn't been right until now to offer these, but it's very, very close to being the right time, I would say. Now, going through these, basically, there are many stages as well. When you tend to think of how to roll out these offerings, you tend to think it's all technology-led. You give the technology, and you then explain what the customer should do with them. This is an energy way of doing things, energy industry way of doing things. The reality is that you do it the other way around. In other words, technology is introduced to the customer slowly. The public communication, and that includes authorities and regulators and so on, should be a major, and consumer groups should be a major part of the communication of these services and benefits early on. And the utility themselves, to be fair, shouldn't get involved in offering things until they've won the hearts and the minds of their customers, because otherwise you'll get this please fuck off kind of feeling mentality from the customer. The utility should realize that until you win the hearts and minds of customers, you will not win their money. And actually, there are many groups out there that can communicate initially better than you can. And the technology is not the solution. The technology is a part of the solution. It's a tool in the solution for the customer. And therefore, you don't just dump technology on them up front. You have to bring it into their lives gradually. And once you've done all of these things, what we're seeing is that eventually you can sell them a whole range of different things, ranging from just very cheap energy efficiency services, ultimately all the way up to smart appliances and smart home and electric car related services, applications, as we mentioned before, that can deliver anything from a third party. But that happens much later on when you've done all those stages that we mentioned earlier. But basically, what I really wanted to say here is then that I understand that many people think that there's not a market for energy efficiency, for electricity and gas. The reality is, as we heard from Mike Gordon yesterday at the reception, for those of you that were here, is that we have seen massive cases, both on a commercial and I mean industrial level, with buildings and offices and all sorts of factories saving lots of money through various services that utilities are offering them and actually gaining very big added value. That's low-hanging fruit, those types of companies. But even in the residential market, there are lots of opportunities if only you go about it in the right way. So I'd just like to say good luck if any of you are interested in that, but try to be positive, because just because the customers are not asking from them doesn't mean that they won't want them. So thank you very much.
You were talking about sharing risk with the customer. When we talk about gas,
yes,
is actually the hourly balancing system the prerequisite for a sharing risk market approach?
Yeah.
Because it is not the fact in all over the world.
Yes.
Also not in Europe. And the question is whether the customer, also on the household level, can actually choose between a firm contract and on one hand, and with let's say high-risk contract linked to the volatile spot market. So this is my
Actually, going to the second one first, actually, when we look at contracts that are offered to customers, your natural assumption is that customers want predictable contracts. They want fixed price contracts. But actually what we're seeing is in the many markets where it is offered to them in the right way and gradually introduced, we're seeing that variable contracts are more popular in Sweden, in Norway. In some of these other markets, customers are adopting these pretty volatile prices, and actually we're seeing that when customers realize how much they can save, and those are transparent, that they want that, but you can't force it on them. As we saw in Australia, in Melbourne, when you try to force those volatile contracts on people, you get hit hard by the publicity, negative publicity. Going back to what you said then about the balancing in the gas market, yes, I think the efficiency and the dynamism of the wholesale market and the balancing market is incredibly important. That we in order to have things to sell to customers in the future, we have to have a more dynamic way of balancing energy, and be it electricity or gas. And because it's those market mechanisms that ultimately create opportunity for new services.